The rain fell in relentless driving sheets, turning the empty night street into a slick, black mirror. He saw her then, a lone figure huddled beside a broken bicycle under the sputtering, unreliable glow of a streetlight. Her raincoat, a thin plastic shield, was plastered to her frame, and her hands trembled as she struggled with the greasy iron chain that had slipped its moorings. He pulled his worn pickup to the shoulder, the engine rumbling a tired protest. A single father just off his shift at the garage, the scent of motor oil still clinging to his hands. He rolled down the window, the cool, damp air a shock against his weary face, and a single question formed in his mind. Rochelle was a girl, still barely a teenager in what looked like a school uniform, doing stranded in the middle of the night. As he knelt to help, the cold asphalt biting through the knee of his jeans, a flicker of silver caught his eye. It was a bracelet on her wrist, delicate and bright against her pale skin, etched with a peculiar, almost corporate-looking symbol. She instinctively yanked her sleeve down to cover it, a flash of genuine fear in her eyes that was gone as quickly as it appeared. He offered a disarming smile, completely unaware that this simple act of kindness was the pivot upon which his entire life was about to turn. A peal of thunder cracked overhead, and in the stark, momentary glare of lightning, he saw it. A sleek, black sedan, parked half a block away, its form menacing and silent in the downpour. It was watching. A cold knot of unease tightened in his gut. This girl, who was she? The modest two-bedroom apartment was quiet, steeped in the specific stillness that only settles after a child has fallen asleep. Jacob eased the door to his daughter's room shut, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the silence. Lily, all of 7 years old, was a small lump under a mountain of blankets, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper that was the anchor of his entire world. On the wall above her bed hung a framed photograph, a smiling woman with eyes the same bright shade of blue as Lily's, her arm draped around a younger, less tired version of himself. It had been 3 years since Sarah's illness had taken her, 3 years of learning the dual roles of mother and father, of packing lunches and fixing engines, of braiding hair and wiping away tears. His life had found a new, albeit difficult, rhythm. Work, Lily. Sleep. Repeat. It was a small life, a demanding one, but it was theirs, and he protected it fiercely. He moved through the small living room, the floorboards groaning a familiar complaint under his work boots. The lingering smell of grilled cheese sandwiches hung in the air, a testament to their simple dinner. His own plate sat on the counter, cold and waiting. The long hours at the garage were taking their toll. A deep ache had settled into the bones of his lower back, a constant companion to the grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms. He ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble scratching his skin. All he wanted was to eat his sandwich, drink a cold beer, and lose himself for an hour in a black-and-white movie from the 1960s before collapsing into bed. The drive home had been draining, the wipers on his old Ford pickup fighting a losing battle against the deluge that had started an hour before his shift ended. The storm was a violent, angry thing, tearing at the city with a fury that felt personal. It was on that lonely stretch of road, less than a mile from his apartment, that he saw her. The flickering street lamp cast a sickly yellow halo around her, isolating her in the vast, wet darkness. He'd almost driven past, his mind already home, but the sight of her small, struggling form had snagged on his conscience. He was a father. He saw the world through that lens now. He saw a child in trouble, and the complex machinery of his life ground to a halt. Leaving his truck idling, a protective cocoon of warmth and light, he stepped out into the storm. The rain was instantly soaking, cold rivulets tracing paths down his neck and back. "Need a hand?" he called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the roar of the wind and water. The girl startled, her head snapping up. For a moment she looked like a cornered animal, poised to flee. Her face was pale, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 16. "The chain," she mumbled, her voice thin and trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. He crouched beside her, the smell of rain and wet asphalt filling his senses. He saw immediately that the chain was not just slipped, but jammed between the gear and the frame, a stubborn knot of metal. "I can fix that," he said, his tone deliberately calm and reassuring. "Happens all the time?" His large, capable hands, so used to the intricate dance of machinery, went to work. He didn't have his tools, but years of practice had made his fingers clever. As he worked the chain free, he tried to make small talk, to ease the tension that radiated from her. "Nasty night to be out. You live around here?" She just shook her head, her eyes darting nervously into the darkness beyond the small pool of light they occupied. Her silence was a wall, and he found himself talking just to fill it. "My name's Jacob, by the way." She offered a quiet, hesitant Anna, a name that felt flimsy and temporary on her tongue. It was then, as he guided the chain back onto the teeth of the sprocket, that his knuckles brushed against her wrist, and he saw the bracelet. It wasn't just the strange symbol, it was the quality of it. It was solid silver, heavy and expensive, a stark contrast to her drenched, generic school uniform and the beat-up 10-speed bicycle. When she pulled her sleeve over it, the fear in her eyes was sharp and undeniable, and the first real seeds of doubt were planted in his mind. This wasn't just a girl with a broken bike. With a final, satisfying click, the chain settled into place. "There you go," he said, wiping his greasy hands on his already soaked jeans. "Good as new." She stood up, pulling the bike with her. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze still fixed on the ground. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The pieces didn't fit. The expensive bracelet, the late hour, the palpable fear. And the car, that black sedan he'd seen in the flash of lightning. His eyes scanned the darkened street again, and he saw it, still there, its engine off, a silent, predatory shape, waiting patiently in the sheeting rain. An irrational, protective instinct washed over him. "Look, it's no night to be out. My apartment is just up the road. You could wait out the storm, call someone." Her reaction was immediate and visceral. "No," she said, the word sharp with panic. She threw a panicked glance in the direction of the car, a look of such profound terror that it made the hair on Jacob's arms stand on end. Without another word of thanks, she swung her leg over the bicycle and pedaled away, disappearing into the watery gloom with a desperate speed. Jacob stood alone in the rain for a long moment, the roar of the storm echoing the sudden turmoil in his mind. He looked from the empty space where she had been to the distant, watching car, and a chilling certainty settled over him. He had just stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple broken bicycle chain. Jacob stood soaked in the rain for a full minute after she was gone. The tail light of her bicycle, a fading red spark that was quickly swallowed by the night. The black sedan remained, an unnerving fixture in the tumultuous landscape. He felt its unseen eyes on him, a pressure against his skin that had nothing to do with the wind or the rain. A primal instinct, the one that had guided him through a life of avoiding trouble, screamed at him to get back in his truck, drive home, and lock the door. He should forget the girl, the bracelet, and the car. He had a daughter to think about. Lily was his whole world, and inviting a storm like the one he felt brewing into their small, fragile life was a risk he had no right to take. He took a step toward his truck, but hesitated. He couldn't shake the image of the sheer terror in the girl's eyes. It was the look of prey, not of a rebellious teenager. He had a choice: ignore it and live with the nagging question, or follow a thread of human decency and see where it led. With a resigned sigh that turned into a plume of white in the cold air, he made his choice. He wasn't built to walk away. He didn't drive directly home. Instead, he made a wide, deliberate loop around the block, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As he passed the spot where the sedan had been parked, he saw it was gone. The street was empty, scrubbed clean by the rain, as if the entire encounter had been a figment of his tired imagination. But the grease on his hands was real, and the knot in his stomach was real. When he finally pulled into his own designated parking spot behind the low-slung apartment building, his headlights swept across a familiar, hunched figure. It was her. She was standing under the meager shelter of the building's awning, her bicycle leaning against the brick wall beside her, her thin frame shivering violently. She looked up as he approached, her expression a miserable mix of desperation and defeat. The storm had clearly been too much for her, and whatever she was running from, she had decided that the man who smelled of motor oil was a safer bet than the open, unforgiving night. "Figured you might not get too far in this weather," Jacob said, his voice gentle as not to spook her. He unlocked the main door to the building and held it open. "Come on inside. You can't stay out here." She hesitated for only a second before ducking past him, wheeling her bike into the dimly lit, musty-smelling hallway. He led her up the single flight of stairs, his wet boots squeaking on the linoleum. Inside his apartment, the warmth was immediate and enveloping. He took her drenched raincoat, which felt as flimsy as paper, and hung it on a hook by the door. "You can leave the bike here," he said, gesturing to a spot against the wall. "The bathroom is just down the hall. There are clean towels under the sink. Go get warmed up." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes, and shuffled off in the direction he'd pointed. While the shower ran, Jacob busied himself in the kitchen, his mind racing. He made 2 mugs of hot chocolate, the simple domestic act a strange counterpoint to the evening's bizarre events. He found a clean t-shirt and a pair of old, soft sweatpants that had belonged to Sarah, and left them folded neatly on a chair outside the bathroom door. When she emerged 20 minutes later, she was transformed. Swamped in his clothes, with her dark hair clean and combed, she looked even younger and more vulnerable. She clutched the warm mug in both hands as if it were a lifeline, sinking into the lumpy armchair in the corner of the living room. Jacob sat on the couch opposite her, giving her space. "My daughter's asleep," he said softly. "Her name is Lily." The girl, Anna, looked toward the closed bedroom door, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crossed her face. Curiosity, perhaps. The silence stretched between them, punctuated by the drumming of the rain against the window pane. He had 100 questions, but he knew pushing her would only make her retreat further. He decided to start with the most obvious, benign assumption. "Look," he began, choosing his words carefully. "If you've run away from home, I get it. Things can get tough. But your folks are probably worried sick." And he was probing, offering her an easy explanation, a simple story to latch onto. This was the red herring, the logical conclusion his mind had constructed to make sense of the situation. A simple case of a runaway teen, perhaps fleeing a difficult family life, maybe even abuse. Her reaction was telling. She didn't deny it, but a strange, sad smile touched her lips. "Something like that," she murmured into her mug. Then she looked up, her eyes finally meeting his, and they held a depth of knowledge and weariness that didn't belong in a 16-year-old's face. "My father will find me. He always does." The words were spoken with a chilling finality, a statement of inevitable fact rather than a hope for reconciliation. It wasn't the voice of a child hoping her parents would come get her. It was the voice of someone who understood the mechanics of being hunted. The statement hung in the air, twisting his simple runaway theory into something more complex and sinister. He had offered her an escape hatch, a way to frame her story in a familiar narrative, but she had subtly rejected it. Her father wasn't just a concerned parent. He was a pursuer. Before he could process the implication, a soft sound came from down the hall. The bedroom door creaked open, and Lily stood there, rubbing her eyes, her favorite stuffed bear clutched in one hand. "Daddy?" she mumbled sleepily. I heard voices. Her eyes landed on the strange girl in the armchair, and instead of shyness, her face lit up with wide-eyed, innocent curiosity, completely oblivious to the dangerous currents swirling in the quiet room. The unexpected appearance of the 7-year-old girl completely shifted the atmosphere in the room. The tension that had been coiled tight between Jacob and Anna seemed to loosen, replaced by the disarming innocence of a sleepy child. Lily padded across the floor, her bear, a well-loved, one-eyed dog named Barnaby, dangling from her hand. She stopped a few feet from the armchair and simply stared, her head tilted. Jacob's protective instincts flared, but he held himself back, watching the silent interaction. Anna, who had been so guarded and withdrawn, seemed to soften under the child's curious gaze. A genuine, unforced smile touched her lips for the first time that night. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who's your friend?" Lily held up the stuffed animal. "This is Barnaby," she announced with the solemn importance only a child can muster. "He's very brave." Jacob watched, fascinated, as this strange girl, who was clearly in some kind of serious trouble, engaged his daughter with a gentle sincerity that he knew couldn't be faked. It was a small moment, but it chipped away another piece of the wall he had built around his suspicions. He convinced Lily to go back to bed with the promise of pancakes for breakfast, a promise that earned him a sleepy but enthusiastic hug. When he returned to the living room, Anna was staring at the framed photograph of Sarah on the mantelpiece. "She's beautiful," Anna said, her voice soft with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "She looks like Lily." Jacob felt the familiar pang of grief, a dull ache that never truly went away. "That's my wife, Sarah," he said, moving to stand beside her. "She passed away a few years ago." He didn't know why he was sharing this with a complete stranger, but it felt right. It was an offering of trust, a piece of his own brokenness laid bare. Anna absorbed his words with a quiet solemnity. "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the shared acknowledgement of loss creating a fragile bridge between them. He decided then to trust his gut, the same instinct that told him how to tune an engine until it hummed just right. This girl wasn't a threat to him or his daughter. She was in danger, and she needed help. He offered her the couch for the night, pulling out a set of clean sheets and a heavy wool blanket from the hall closet. She accepted without protest, her exhaustion now clearly visible in the slump of her shoulders and the dark circles under her eyes. As she was getting settled, a small black notebook fell from the pocket of the damp school uniform she had folded neatly on the coffee table. She snatched it up with a panicked quickness that immediately piqued his interest, clutching it to her chest like a sacred object. He pretended not to notice her frantic reaction, instead focusing on fluffing a pillow. But the image was seared into his mind, a simple, unadorned moleskin-style notebook, held with the desperation of someone protecting their most vital secret. He bid her good night, turned off the lights, and retreated to his own room. But sleep was a distant country he knew he wouldn't be visiting. He lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the rain, which had finally softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof. The question circled in his mind, relentless and unyielding. The bracelet, the car, her father, and now the notebook. They were all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet see. The next morning, the world outside was washed clean, the rising sun glinting off wet streets. The smell of coffee filled the small apartment, a familiar and comforting ritual. He found Anna already awake, sitting on the couch with the wool blanket wrapped around her, the black notebook resting in her lap. She was staring out the window, looking like a shipwrecked sailor contemplating an uncertain shore. Lily, true to form, was the one who broke the spell. She emerged from her room, fully dressed and chattering about a dream she'd had involving a talking squirrel. She immediately gravitated toward Anna, asking her a stream of unfiltered questions about her favorite color, whether she liked cartoons, and if she knew how to make friendship bracelets. To his surprise, Anna answered each question patiently, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet, weary calm. For a few hours, a strange and temporary domesticity settled over them. They ate pancakes, and Anna showed a surprising talent for making them into animal shapes, earning Lily's unwavering adoration. It was while they were clearing the breakfast dishes that he saw it. The small television in the corner of the living room was on, tuned to a 24-hour news channel he sometimes left on for background noise. A local news anchor was speaking with a serious expression. "Still no updates in the disappearance of the city's most prominent heiress," the anchor said. "Police are asking for the public's help, but the family has requested privacy and has refused to release a current photograph to the media." An older, pixelated photo flashed on the screen. It was a formal-looking portrait of a much younger girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, her face scrubbed and smiling awkwardly for the camera. The image was blurry and dated, the quality poor. It was impossible to be certain, but there was something familiar in the shape of the eyes, a resemblance that sent a jolt through him. He glanced at Anna. Her back was to the television, but her shoulders had gone rigid. She knew what was on the screen without even looking. He quickly turned the television off, the sudden silence deafening. She didn't turn around, but he saw her hands tighten their grip on the notebook, her knuckles turning white. The trust they had started to build was now overlaid with a new, palpable layer of tension. He wasn't just sheltering a runaway anymore. He was harboring a missing person at the center of a major news story. A fragile, unspoken agreement settled over the small apartment. By noon, Jacob had called the garage and told his boss he was taking a sick day, a rare occurrence that earned him a grumble of concern from his manager. He couldn't explain that he was playing host to a fugitive heiress, so he simply mumbled something about a stomach bug. The lie sat uneasily in his gut, the first of what he suspected would be many compromises. For the rest of the day, they existed in a strange bubble of borrowed normalcy. Anna, it turned out, was remarkably good with Lily. They spent hours on the floor of the living room building, elaborate castles out of worn, wooden blocks, and staging epic adventures for Barnaby the bear. Jacob watched them from the kitchen, his hands busy fixing a leaky faucet, his mind a turbulent sea of conflict. A part of him, the lonely widower part, was warmed by the sight. The easy laughter that filled the apartment was a sound he hadn't realized how much he missed. It felt frighteningly like a family. But the other part of him, the pragmatic, protective father part, was screaming in silent alarm. Every innocent giggle was a tick on a clock he couldn't see, counting down to a moment when the dangerous reality they were ignoring would come crashing through their door. He didn't move from his chair for what felt like an eternity. The glow of the laptop screen painted his face in a pale, cold light. The Valerius Group. The name itself felt heavy, a monolith of power and influence that could crush a man like him as casually as stepping on an ant. The silence in the small apartment was suddenly suffocating, filled with the immensity of his discovery. He closed the laptop with a decisive snap, the sound cutting through the quiet like a gunshot. He walked back into the living room, his movements stiff, deliberate. Anna was on the floor with Lily, the two of them whispering and laughing as they finished a complicated, multicolored friendship bracelet. The scene was so profoundly normal, so achingly domestic, that it felt like a cruel joke. It was a beautiful, fragile lie, and he knew it was his duty to shatter it. "Lily," he said, his voice strained, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "Honey, can you go to your room and play with Barnaby for a little while? The grown-ups need to talk." Lily, sensing the sudden shift in the air, looked from her father's grim face to Anna's worried one. She nodded silently, scooped up her bear, and padded off to her room, leaving an immediate and chilling void. Jacob waited until he heard her door click shut. Then he turned to Anna, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to say a word. She saw the knowledge in his eyes, and the last vestiges of the frightened teenager fell away, replaced by the grim resignation of a cornered soldier. Her face paled, and she clutched the small black notebook that was, as always, within her reach. "Your name isn't Anna, is it?" he asked, the question flat, devoid of accusation. It was a simple request for a truth he already knew. She shook her head, her dark hair falling across her face. "It's Elara," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and important. Elara Valerius. He let the name hang in the air between them. "Your father is Elysian Valerius, head of the Valerius Group." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. She flinched as if he had struck her, then finally met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a desperate, fiery intensity he hadn't seen before. "He's not just a CEO, Jacob. He's a monster." The words came tumbling out of her, a frantic, whispered torrent. The dam of secrecy had broken. "I wasn't running away from home. I was escaping. I found something terrible," she explained, her voice low and rapid, the sentences tripping over one another in her haste. For years, she had lived a gilded, isolated life, shielded from the true nature of her father's business. But she was smart, and she was observant. She started noticing things, discrepancies in financial reports she wasn't supposed to see, hushed late-night phone calls about sanitizing accounts and liquidating liabilities that were clearly not business terms. Her father, underestimating her, had given her unrestricted access to the family's internal network. She used it. For 6 months, she dug, and what she found was a vast, sprawling criminal enterprise hidden behind the gleaming facade of the corporation. "It's not just creative accounting," she said, her hands trembling as she opened the notebook. "It's money laundering on a global scale. Billions of dollars. For cartels, for rogue states, for terrorists. The shipping division isn't just moving cargo, it's moving weapons and illicit goods. The financial branch isn't just investing money. It's washing blood off of it." The notebook was filled, not with diary entries, but with page after page of dense, coded script, account numbers, routing information, dates, names, offshore shell corporations. It was a detailed ledger of her father's crimes. The final piece clicked into place for Jacob, resolving the last of his naive assumptions. "So you're not a victim of abuse," he said, the realization dawning on him. "You're a witness. You're a whistleblower." Elara nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He found out I was digging. One of his security chiefs, a man I've known my whole life, tried to take the notebook from me. He cornered me in the library. When I refused, he hurt me." She unconsciously rubbed her arm, a flicker of pain in her eyes. "That's when I knew I couldn't just expose him. I had to run, or he would have locked me away. Or worse. I grabbed what I could and left. I've been trying to find a way to get this information to someone who can't be bought by him. But he has people everywhere. The police, politicians. He owns them. That black car wasn't watching me. It was hunting me." The full weight of his situation crashed down on Jacob. This was not a family drama. He was sitting in his tiny apartment with the living, breathing evidence that could bring down a global criminal empire. And that empire was actively, ruthlessly searching for its missing link. Every second she spent here, she was painting a target on his back, and more importantly, on Lily's. His mind reeled. He could end this, right now. He could make a phone call, an anonymous tip to the police, or even to the Valerius Group themselves. He could tell them where she was. They would come, they would take her, and the storm would pass over his small life, leaving him and Lily untouched. It was the smart choice. It was the safe choice. The instinct for self-preservation was a physical force, screaming at him to save his daughter, to cut this cancer out of his life before it metastasized. He stood up and began to pace the small room like a caged animal, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was just a mechanic, a single father. How could he possibly stand against a man who treated countries like chess pieces? He stopped, his back to her, and stared at Lily's bedroom door. He saw her face in his mind, her bright, innocent smile. He would do anything to protect that. Anything. And that was the core of his dilemma. Handing Alara over would protect Lily from the immediate, external threat. But what kind of man would he be then? What kind of father? One who taught his daughter to look the other way, to sacrifice a person in danger for the sake of your own comfort. One who taught her that justice was only for people who didn't have to risk anything for it. The image of Sarah, his late wife, flashed in his mind. She had been a fighter, a woman of fierce moral conviction. He knew what she would tell him to do. He turned around slowly and looked at Alara. She was no longer just a girl. She was a responsibility. A terrified, impossibly brave young woman who had chosen to do the right thing at an unimaginable cost. In that moment, the choice, as terrifying as it was, became clear. It was never really a choice at all. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm, a single word that sealed his fate. "Okay, we're going to figure this out, together." He was wrestling with this internal war when the illusion of peace was first pierced. He was sitting at his small desk in the corner of the living room, trying to pay a few bills on his aging laptop. The website for his small credit union was clunky and slow, and he muttered in frustration as a security page loaded. Lily, drawn by her father's annoyance, came over and started climbing into his lap, her sticky fingers dangerously close to the keyboard. "Can I play the pancake game?" she asked. "In a minute, sweetie," he said, trying to navigate the login screen. It was then that Anna, who had been quietly reading on the couch, came over. "Here, let me," she said, her voice soft. Before he could react, she leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. "Oh, it's a tiered authentication system," she said with the casual authority of an IT professional. "The interface is old, but the back-end protocol is pretty standard for moving anything over $10,000. And she pointed a slender finger at the screen. "You just have to bypass the secondary handshake here." She typed a short string of characters into a field he hadn't even noticed, and the page immediately clicked through to his account summary. Jacob stared, dumbfounded. He quickly closed the laptop, a cold dread washing over him. It wasn't just that she knew how to navigate a complex banking portal. It was the vocabulary she used, the effortless familiarity with a world of high-stakes finance that was as foreign to him as deep space. The comment about $10,000 had been so casual, as if it were pocket change. The image of the scared, helpless girl in the rain was being rapidly replaced by someone far more complex and formidable. He looked at her, and she seemed to realize her mistake. She quickly averted her gaze, a blush creeping up her neck. The trust between them flickered. He saw not just a girl in trouble, but a gatekeeper of immense secrets, secrets that were clearly tied to vast sums of money. The red herring of a simple runaway fleeing family abuse was completely dead in the water. This was something else entirely, and the scale of it terrified him. He knew, with a sudden and chilling certainty, that he could no longer afford to be a passive observer in her story. He had to know who he was protecting. Later that afternoon, while Anna was patiently showing Lily how to weave a friendship bracelet out of colored thread, he retreated to his bedroom with his laptop, closing the door behind him. He needed to find the source of that symbol. He opened a search engine, his fingers hovering over the keys. How do you search for something you've only seen for a fleeting moment? He started with simple terms. Silver bracelet, strange symbol. The results were a meaningless flood of New Age jewelry and fantasy merchandise. He tried to be more specific, sketching the symbol on a piece of paper from memory. It was geometric, almost like a stylized letter E, intertwined with a V, enclosed in a sharp, angular circle. He added more keywords: heiress, corporate logo, family crest. Page after page of results yielded nothing. Frustration mounted. He felt foolish, like a man hunting a ghost with a butterfly net. He was about to give up when he decided to try a different approach, focusing on the context. Wealthiest families in the city, he typed, followed by corporate symbols. He scrolled through images of well-known logos, none of them a match. On a whim, he changed city to nation. The search results shifted, becoming more global, more powerful. He clicked on an article titled Titans of Industry, the Dynasties Behind the Global Economy. He scrolled through profiles of oil magnates and tech billionaires, their corporate logos familiar and ubiquitous. And then he saw it. Halfway down the page, his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a profile of the Valerius Group, a sprawling multinational conglomerate with interests in shipping, finance, and private military contracting. A global empire veiled in corporate secrecy. And there, beside the stern, black-and-white photograph of its founder, was their corporate emblem, the family crest. It was the symbol from the bracelet. The entwined E and V stood for Elysian Valerius. The article mentioned the current CEO, a ruthless patriarch who had inherited the empire, and a single reclusive daughter. No name was given for her. No photo. Just a footnote in the story of a powerful man. Jacob stared at the screen, the pieces crashing into place with the force of a physical blow. The bracelet wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a brand, a signifier of belonging to one of the most powerful and reputedly ruthless corporate dynasties on the planet. Anna wasn't just a missing heiress. She was the sole heir to the Valerius Group. And she wasn't just running from a concerned father. She was running from an emperor. The small, fragile bubble of normalcy in his apartment had just been shattered, and he was standing directly in the blast radius. The morning after Jacob's decision was the calm before a hurricane. The air in the apartment was thick with unspoken tension, a fragile truce between fear and resolve. They moved like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones, as if loud noises might alert the predators they knew were circling. Jacob kept the blinds drawn, turning his home into a dim, protected cave. Every creak of the floorboards from the apartment above, every car that drove past on the street below, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his system. His world had shrunk to these four walls, and the overpowering need to protect the two young women within them. It was shortly after noon when the first tremor of the earthquake hit. It came not as a pounding on the door, but as a professionally produced, emotionally manipulative plea on national television. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen, followed by the image of a solemn, powerfully built man in a bespoke suit, his face a mask of paternal grief. It was Elysian Valerius. He was holding a press conference from a room that looked more like a throne room than an office. He spoke with a deep, resonant voice that commanded authority and pity in equal measure. He spoke of his beloved daughter, Clara, describing her as a brilliant but troubled young woman who had been struggling with severe mental health issues since the tragic loss of her mother. He claimed she had fallen under the influence of dangerous individuals who had preyed on her vulnerability, kidnapping her and feeding her paranoid delusions for their own financial gain. He announced a $10 million reward for any information leading to her safe return, no questions asked. The screen filled with a recent, professionally taken photograph of Clara. Not a blurry, decade-old image, but a vibrant, recent shot that captured her likeness perfectly. In an instant, Clara's face was public knowledge. She was no longer a ghost. She was a target. Jacob's blood ran cold. Valerius wasn't just searching for his daughter. He was weaponizing the public against her, painting any potential ally as a kidnapper and a terrorist. They were trapped. "He's twisting everything," Clara whispered, her face ashen as she stared at her father's duplicitous performance. "He's making me the villain. He's making you the villain." The strategy was brutally effective. They couldn't walk down the street, couldn't ask for help, couldn't even exist outside this apartment without being seen as a criminal and his victim. Hiding was no longer an option. Their only path forward was to attack. "We can't wait for someone to find us," Jacob said, his mind racing, the mechanic's instinct to diagnose and fix a problem kicking into high gear. "We have to get your story out, now, before his version becomes the only truth." The police were out. The mainstream media was a risk. Valerius could bury the story with a single phone call. They needed someone untouchable, an independent voice with a reputation for taking on giants and winning. An idea sparked in Jacob's memory. "There's a journalist," he said, thinking aloud. "Her name is Marian Walsh. She used to be a lead investigative reporter for NBS, but they fired her for digging too deep into a banking scandal. Now she runs her own independent news site. They say she can't be bought or intimidated." Finding a way to contact her was a terrifying risk. Every phone call, every email could be traced. Using his own laptop was out of the question. They needed a secure, anonymous channel. Jacob's mind went to the public library downtown, a place of transient, untraceable internet access. It was a desperate, high-risk plan, but it was the only one they had. Leaving Lily with a trusted neighbor under the guise of a family emergency, a lie that felt like swallowing glass, they slipped out the back of the apartment building. Every face on the street seemed to be watching them, every passing car a potential threat. The 15-minute drive to the library felt like crossing a war zone. Inside, surrounded by the quiet hum of students and researchers, they found a vacant computer terminal in a secluded corner. With trembling fingers, Jacob found Marian Walsh's website. It had a secure submission portal for whistleblowers. He typed a short, cryptic message. "Have evidence linking Valerius Group to global money laundering. Daughter is witness. In danger. Need to meet." He left a disposable email address he'd created just for this and a time and place. 10 o'clock that night, at a 24-hour university diner on the other side of the city. The hours leading up to the meeting were the longest of Jacob's life. The diner was a calculated choice, public but anonymous, with a constant flow of people that made surveillance difficult. When they walked in, the smell of stale coffee and fried food hung in the air. A woman sat alone in a booth in the back corner, a laptop open in front of her. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. It was Marian Walsh. She watched them approach, her expression a mask of professional skepticism. The first words out of her mouth were blunt. "You have 60 seconds to convince me this isn't a hoax before I walk out of here." Clara didn't flinch. She sat down, opened the black notebook, and pushed it across the table. "This is not a hoax," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is my father's private ledger. On page 42, you'll find the routing numbers for an illegal arms shipment to West Africa, disguised as humanitarian aid. On page 71, you'll find the shell corporations used to launder $300 million for the Serrano cartel. I can decode every entry for you." Marian's eyes scanned the dense, coded pages. Her skepticism slowly dissolved, replaced by the electric, predatory focus of a journalist who has just been handed the biggest story of her career. What happened next was a blur of controlled chaos. Marian Walsh was a force of nature. She made one phone call, speaking in clipped, coded language. Within 20 minutes, a discreet van was waiting for them in the alley behind the diner. They were taken to a secure location, the basement office of an independent broadcast studio. Time was critical. Marian's team worked with feverish intensity, setting up cameras and a secure, encrypted satellite link that would bypass traditional networks and beam their signal globally. There was no time for rehearsal. Marian looked at Clara. "Are you ready?" Clara took a deep breath and gave a firm nod. An hour later, she was live, her face broadcast to millions around the world on every independent newsfeed and social platform that Marian's network could access. She spoke with a calm, chilling clarity, her voice ringing with indisputable truth. She held up the notebook. She detailed her father's crimes. She exposed the rot at the core of the Valerius Group. As she spoke, the world reacted. Stock tickers for the Valerius Group began to plummet. Government agencies, forced into a corner by the public outcry, began announcing emergency investigations. The lie her father had so carefully constructed was being systematically dismantled in real time on a global stage. The broadcast ended. The storm had broken. As Marion's team quickly bundled them toward the exit, their faces grim with the knowledge that the hunt would now be more desperate than ever, Jacob glanced out a side window. A sleek black sedan screeched to a halt at the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The same car from that first rainy night. Two men in sharp, dark suits jumped out, their faces hard, their movements ruthlessly efficient. They were too late. "That's them," Clara breathed, grabbing Jacob's arm. "My father's fixers." Jacob pulled her away from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. They had won the battle of information, but he knew with terrifying certainty that the war for their survival had just begun. In the chaotic aftermath of the broadcast, everything moved with blinding speed. Marion Walsh's team proved to be as efficient as a special forces unit, spiriting them through a labyrinth of back alleys and unmarked vehicles. Their destination was the sterile, imposing lobby of a federal building, where grim-faced men and women in dark suits took charge. This was where they had to say goodbye. There was no time for a long, drawn-out farewell. In the echoing, marble-floored hallway, under the cold gaze of government agents, Clara turned to Jacob. The impossibly brave whistleblower was, for a moment, just a 17-year-old girl again. "You saved my life," she said, her voice thick with an emotion too deep for words. "You and Lily. I will never forget that." Jacob simply nodded, his own throat tight. "Be safe, Clara." He watched as they led her away down a secure corridor, disappearing behind a set of heavy steel doors. She was on her way to a new life, one of testimony and anonymity, protected by the very system her father had sought to corrupt. The storm she had unleashed would rage for months, but her war was finally over. 6 months later, the world was a different place. The Valerius Group had imploded in a spectacular fireball of indictments, frozen assets, and public disgrace. Elysian Valerius was awaiting trial in a maximum security facility, his empire dismantled, his power broken. The Black Notebook, now famously known as the Valerius Ledger, had become the key to unraveling a dozen other criminal enterprises. Jacob read about it sometimes, a distant observer of the tidal wave he had helped create. His own life was almost unrecognizable. The federal task force that had taken over the case had been impressed by his courage and level-headedness. A week after the broadcast, a formal offer had arrived. They needed people like him, not soldiers or lawyers, but ordinary, dependable people with unshakable integrity. He was now a logistics coordinator for the Witness Security Program, a quiet, stable job with a salary that was more than he had ever dreamed of making at the garage. He and Lily had moved into a small but bright house in a quiet suburban neighborhood with good schools and a yard with an oak tree. The smell of motor oil had been replaced by the scent of freshly cut grass. One evening in early spring, he was walking home from the park with Lily, her small hand held firmly in his. A soft rain had begun to fall, the kind that smells of clean earth and new beginnings. It wasn't the violent, angry downpour of that fateful night, but a gentle, cleansing shower. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting warm, steady pools of gold onto the wet pavement. They stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, standing directly under the glow of one of the lamps. It illuminated the raindrops, turning them into a curtain of shimmering diamond. Lily looked up at him, her face full of the simple, unquestioning happiness of a child who feels safe. Jacob looked at her, and then up at the steady, unwavering light, and he remembered. He remembered the sputtering, unreliable glow of another lamp, the relentless cold rain, and the shivering girl with a broken bicycle. He remembered the fear, the doubt, the impossible choice that had stood before him. He had stopped that night, simply because he was a father, and he saw a child in need. He had no idea that in choosing to help her, he was choosing this new life for his own daughter. The simple act of kindness, of refusing to look away, had been the pivot upon which his entire world had turned for the better. The rain still fell, but it no longer felt menacing. It was just water, washing the world clean. He squeezed Lily's hand, a wave of profound gratitude washing over him. The light was no longer a lonely beacon in a dark, dangerous world. It was just a light, illuminating their safe path home.